Nwosu knew she had made a mistake the moment his hand closed around her wrist. But the mistake wasn't pulling away. The mistake was that she didn't want to. She had been walking, chart in hand, third-floor corridor of Yonsei Premier Medical Center. Lights dimmer than regulation because maintenance had deprioritized the panel twice, and nobody had pushed back hard enough. She had been minding every piece of her own business. And then his hand, around her wrist, certain, final. Like a decision that had already been made long before she arrived in this corridor. Long before she arrived in this city. She turned. He was exactly what she had filed away from 2 previous sightings, and somehow more. Charcoal suit, sharp jaw, to eyes that were doing something she had no clean clinical term for, studying her with the focused stillness of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and was now simply confirming that reality matched expectation. She had seen powerful men before. She had seen dangerous men before. She had never seen a man who was both and more neither as a performance. "I reviewed the overnight incident report," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. "Ward C, patient in 3-14. You made a unilateral call to adjust his medication protocol without attending authorization." Ada looked at his hand around her wrist, then at his face. "He was crashing," she said evenly. "The attending was unreachable. Protocol allows nurse override in acute deterioration. I stayed within parameters." "You did." He didn't deny it. "You also documented it in a way that made the attending's absence invisible." "I documented what happened clinically. I'm not in the business of writing other people's narratives." Something shifted in his eyes. So slight she would have missed it if she hadn't spent 3 years reading the micro-expressions of people in crisis. His grip changed, not releasing, shifting, from capture to something that had no clean name. He leaned forward, just slightly, just enough that she caught his scent. Cedar, something darker beneath it, cold air and worn leather. A man who had just come in from a night that belonged only to him. "You can't satisfy me." The words landed softly, not an insult, an observation. A diagnosis delivered by someone who had run every available calculation and arrived at a conclusion he was simply informing her of. The way a man tells you about weather. Ada felt her pulse react before her mind could stop it. He released her wrist, stepped back, straightened his jacket with one smooth motion, and walked away without looking back. Ada stood in the dim corridor, chart still in hand, wrist still warm where his fingers had been, and did something she hadn't done since Lagos. She stood completely still and felt the ground shift beneath her. Not from fear, from recognition. The kind that arrived before understanding. The kind the body processed faster than the mind and refused to explain. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that he already knew everything about hers. She didn't know that 3 floors below, in a room with no external cameras, a file with her uncle's name on it was sitting inside a briefcase that Dante Virelli had carried across 4 countries to get to her. She didn't know any of it yet, but her body, which had always been smarter than her timing, already did. You already feel it. Drop a comment and tell me, what just happened in that corridor? Subscribe and stay in. This story is only getting started. Ada Nwosu had left Lagos at 3 a.m., not because the flight demanded it, though it did, but because leaving in the dark felt more honest. Leaving in daylight would have meant someone might see her face, might see what she was carrying. And Ada had decided somewhere between the last conversation with Amika and the first real conversation she'd had with herself in 3 years, that she was done being seen until she chose to be. She was 31, trauma nurse, specialization in acute care, 2-year contract with Yonsei Premier Medical Center through an international healthcare exchange program that had taken her 4 months to apply for and 6 weeks to stop second-guessing. She had packed 2 suitcases, left the apartment she'd shared with a man who had perfected the art of making her feel like the problem, and then boarded a plane to Seoul with the quiet, deliberate momentum of someone who had finally decided that survival was not the same thing as living. Seoul greeted her with cold air and organized chaos. She had studied Korean for 18 months before arrival. Medical terminology first, conversational second. Her pronunciation was careful, her vocabulary solid. What she hadn't prepared for was the tone, the specific register of hierarchy and deference that ran through Korean professional life like an invisible current. She felt it immediately, in the way colleagues held their spines differently when a superior entered, in the silence that meant respect rather than awkwardness, familiar and foreign at once. Minji Park found her on the second day, sharp-faced, quick-eyed, the specific gift of reading a room without appearing to. She'd brought coffee, black, small sugar packet on the side. People who brought options paid attention. "You're the exchange nurse," Minji said, sitting across from her without asking. "From Nigeria." "Lagos," Ada confirmed. "Your Korean is better than you think. You're being too careful with it." She tilted her head. "The attending you covered for last night filed a formal complaint this morning." Ada wrapped both hands around her coffee. "I know. It got redirected." Ada looked up. Minji's expression was measured. "Someone above attending level flagged your incident report before it reached HR. It went up instead of sideways." A pause. "That doesn't happen here. Not for exchange staff. And not for anyone below department head." "Who flagged it?" Minji glanced at the door. The unconscious motion of someone who had learned that certain names carried weight better not invoked at full volume in open spaces. Then back. "The Virelli Group's CEO has been on site this quarter. Restructuring review." She set her coffee down carefully. "His name is Dante Virelli." A pause that had its own specific texture. "You should know two things about him," Minji said, her voice dropping. "First, there are two kinds of people in this hospital when it comes to him. The ones who stay on his right side and the ones who've made the mistake of not." She paused. "There used to be a third kind. People who thought the line didn't apply to them." Ada looked at her. "Used to be?" Minji's expression didn't change. "Dr. Park Sung-jin, senior cardiologist, 20 years at this hospital. He challenged a Virelli Group contract decision in a board meeting 6 weeks ago. Directly, in front of 12 people." She picked up her coffee. "He hasn't been on the roster since. No resignation announcement. No farewell. His nameplate is gone from his office door. Nobody asked about it." The break room was quiet. "And the second thing?" Ada asked. Minji met her eyes. "He doesn't notice people by accident," she said. "Ever." Ada would think about those words later. Much later, when the full shape of everything became visible, she would think about Minji saying he doesn't notice people by accident. And she would understand that Minji, sharp as she was, had still only seen the surface of how true that was. Because Dante Virelli had not noticed Ada Nwosu by accident. He had been looking for her specifically, for 8 months before she ever set foot in Seoul. 8 months before Ada landed at Incheon, a man had died in Lagos. His name was Dr. Chukwuemeka Osei, a public health researcher with a joint appointment at the University of Lagos and a Geneva-based global health organization. 53 years old. No prior cardiac history. No warning signs. He had collapsed in his office on a Tuesday afternoon and had been pronounced dead before the ambulance arrived. The death had been ruled natural. It was not natural. Dante knew this because he had spent 6 weeks verifying it. Not because he had ordered it, but because he needed to know whether someone within his own network had, and whether that someone understood the full weight of what they had done and what it would now require him to do in response. The answer to the first question was yes. The answer to the second was that they had not fully understood. They did now. Dr. Osei had been working in the final months of his life on a data set, patient outcome records from 4 hospital networks across Asia and Europe, all of them majority owned by the Virelli Group. He had found something in the data, a pattern of facility transactions that were not entirely medical in nature, shell entities, financial instruments, a 12-year architecture that was perfectly legal on its surface and deeply, specifically not legal underneath. He had been 3 weeks from taking it to a regulatory body in Geneva when his heart stopped. But before he died, he had shared the data set with one person, not a colleague, not a journalist, not a lawyer, his niece, a trauma nurse in Lagos named Ada Nwosu, who had received it in an encrypted file she'd never opened because her uncle had sent it with a note that said, "Keep this safe for me. I'll explain when I see you." And then he had not seen her again. Dante had known about the file for 6 months. He had read Ada's full personnel file in 40 minutes. Medical records, employment history, academic background, personal associations. He had noted the exchange program application with the particular attention of a man who understood that timing was never coincidental. She had applied 4 months after her uncle's death, which meant grief had moved her, which meant she had not yet connected the dots between the file on her encrypted drive and the reason she was now alone in the world in a way she hadn't been before. She was not a threat. She was a liability. Not because of what she knew, but because of what she was carrying without knowing she was carrying it. He had made 3 calls. He had ensured her application was not merely approved, but prioritized. He had brought her to Seoul where he could see her, where he could determine whether anyone else was already looking, where he could control the variables around her the way he controlled every variable that mattered. That was what he told himself in the beginning. By the 3rd week, the variables had stopped feeling like variables. What he had not told Ada, what he would have to tell her eventually, when the time was no longer something he could manage, was this. Someone else was also looking for the file. Someone who had known about it longer than Dante had. Someone who had been the reason Dr. Ose's heart had stopped on a Tuesday afternoon in Lagos. And that someone had, 3 weeks ago, placed a person inside Yonsei Premier Medical Center. Dante had identified them. He had not yet decided what to do about it, because what he wanted to do about it and what was strategically correct were 2 different things. And for the first time in his professional life, what he wanted to do was being influenced by something that had nothing to do with strategy. A trauma nurse from Lagos who pushed back on everything and documented clinical truth without apology and grabbed his lapel in a stalled elevator and had no idea how much danger she was already in. He appeared in the elevator on a Wednesday. Ada had been running 12 minutes late. A pediatric patient in Ward B had been crying for 20 minutes, and there was no version of Ada Nwosu that walked past a crying child. She'd settled the girl, notified the ward nurse, and was now riding the elevator with her badge in one hand and her hair being pinned up with the other. The doors opened at the 2nd floor. He stepped in. Behind him, 2 junior administrators who had been walking in his direction both stopped at the elevator threshold without coordinating it. They'd simply stopped. Like an invisible perimeter existed, and they both understood precisely where its edge was. One of them had started to say something and the sound died before it became a word. Ada finished pinning her hair. He stood at the opposite corner. I said nothing for several floors. Then, Ward B, room 12. She's been here 3 weeks. Responds better to staff who sit at her eye level. Ada turned and looked at him directly for the first time in a closed space. I know, she said. That's why I was late. He looked at her with something like confirmation. Like she'd answered a question he'd asked internally, a question she hadn't known he was asking. The elevator opened. He stepped out. She followed on the same floor, walked 12 steps in the same direction before he turned and she continued straight. Ada told herself the pull at the base of her sternum was simply the awareness of being assessed. She'd been assessed by men before. Emeka had assessed her for weaknesses, for which version of her was malleable enough to shape. Dante Virelli assessed her like someone reading a document they had traveled a very long way to find. The distinction unsettled her more than the similarity would have. The Friday that showed her who he really was came at 8 p.m. Ada was at the nurse's station reviewing post-op notes when she felt the atmospheric shift and looked up to find him at the far end of the corridor in conversation with Director Kwon. Director Kwon was 61 years old, 30 years in Korean hospital administration, the kind of man who corrected ministers in meetings and had never, in Ada's observation, adjusted his posture for anyone. He was adjusting it now, both hands clasped in front of him, shoulders slightly forward, eyes that would not quite meet Dante's directly, tracking his chin line, his collar, the space just below his gaze. Not the deference of professional hierarchy, the deference of a man who had learned, through specific experience, what happened when deference was withheld. Dante spoke 4 sentences, quietly, without gesture or emphasis. Director Kwon nodded 3 times. He did not speak once. Dante turned and walked away. Director Kwon stood in the corridor for a full 5 seconds after he left, not moving, not reaching for his phone, in the specific stillness of a man waiting to be certain the presence had fully departed before he allowed himself to exhale. Then he exhaled and walked quickly in the opposite direction. Ada watched this from the nurse's station. She had seen many things in her clinical career. She had triaged disasters and talked people through their worst moments and read the body language of people under extreme duress. She had never seen a 61-year-old hospital director exhale with relief at someone's departure. She looked back down at her notes. What, she thought carefully, is the Virelli Group actually? The Tuesday that changed the register came at 9 p.m. Ada was at the medication dispensary, frowning at a dosing flag she was 90% certain was a data entry error, but couldn't confirm without cross-referencing. You don't behave like someone who needs this job. She didn't startle. She had developed at some point in the past 2 weeks an unconscious readiness for his voice. She wasn't sure whether that concerned her. Define need, she said, not looking up. He stepped beside her, close enough to be deliberate. He looked at the screen. Most people at this level are running towards something, he said. Ambition, experience. Resume capital. A pause. You're not running toward anything. She looked at him. And you don't behave like someone who saves lives, she said. The words landed clean and direct between them. He didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly and held her gaze, and the silence stretched like something being measured and found accurate. No, he said, I don't. Said it the way people said things they had no interest in defending. He glanced at the screen. The flag is a transcription error. Original prescription reads 0.25, entry reads 2.5. Patient's chart from the referring clinic has the correct figure. Page 4, third paragraph. Ada checked. Third paragraph. Right. She looked up, but he was already walking away. In his wake, she noticed the 2 orderlies at the far end of the corridor had moved 3 feet to the left without being asked. Unconscious clearance for a man who had never once requested it and had never once needed to. He read my patient's file, she thought. Before he ever spoke to me in that corridor, he already knew which ward I worked, which patients I carried, which decisions I'd made. She stood at the dispensary with that knowledge settling into her chest like cold water finding its level and thought, that is not the behavior of a man who noticed me by accident. Minji found her between shifts with the expression she wore when she had information she wasn't sure how to deliver. Ada recognized it immediately. What happened? Someone came to reception this morning, Minji said. She kept her voice low, though the corridor was empty. While you were in Ward C, a man, Korean, mid-40s. He asked about the international exchange staff, specifically about the Nigerian nurse. She paused. He said he was from a public health oversight body in Geneva. He showed credentials. Ada felt something cold move through her. Did anyone give him information? The receptionist gave him your name and ward assignment, standard procedure, exchange staff aren't confidential. Minji's eyes were steady and concerned. But Ada, I ran the organization name he gave against the Geneva registry. And it exists. It's legitimate, but it has no active oversight mandate in South Korea. She held Ada's gaze. He wasn't here officially. He was here personally. Ada stood in the corridor and felt the cold thing in her chest spread outward. Someone had come looking for her. Not for the exchange program, not for the hospital, for her, specifically. Did you tell anyone? Ada asked. Minji hesitated. One beat too long. Minji, I mentioned it to the security desk, she said carefully. It's standard protocol for unverified external visitors. Ada nodded, kept her expression level, but she was already thinking, the security desk reports to building management. Building management reports to the administrative wing. The administrative wing, during a Virelli Group restructuring review, reports to... She stopped the thought. She needed to think before she spoke. She needed to think before she did anything. Because if someone had already come to the hospital looking for her, before she had even opened the file, before she had even understood why she was here, then something was already in motion that had started long before she arrived in Seoul. And the man who had brought her here already knew. She found him in his office at 4 p.m. The broad-shouldered man was outside the door today, not inside. He saw her coming and stood without being asked. He didn't stop her. He simply watched her walk past him to the office door with the specific watchfulness of someone who had been told to observe and not intervene. That, she registered. He'd been told she could pass. She opened the door. Dante looked up from his desk. He did not look surprised. When he never looked surprised, but today there was something else in his face. Something that looked like a man who had been waiting for a conversation he'd been calculating how to start. "Someone came to reception this morning," she said. "I know." He set down his pen. "I've known since 2:24 p.m. "Who was he?" Dante looked at her for a moment. "Sit down, Ada." "I don't want to sit down." "Who was he?" "His name is Kwon Jae-won. He works for a private intelligence firm operating out of 3 cities, Geneva, Singapore, and Lagos." He held her gaze. "He has been trying to locate your uncle's data set for approximately 10 months. 10 months. 2 months before her uncle died." Ada processed this. "He was looking before my uncle?" "Yes." "Which means my uncle knew someone was looking?" "Yes." "Which means—" She stopped. The cold thing in her chest had stopped spreading and had simply settled, heavy and still, into something she couldn't avoid naming. "My uncle didn't die of a cardiac event." Dante held her gaze. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He simply looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and let the silence be the answer. The specific silence of a man who had known this for 6 months and had been carrying it and was now watching her arrive at the same place he had been standing alone. Ada sat down, not because he'd asked her to, because her legs had made the decision before her mind did. "He was killed," she said, quietly, to the floor, to the specific pattern of the office carpet. "Because of the file." "Because of what was in it," Dante said. His voice, for the first time since she'd known him, had something underneath the control. Something careful and quiet that was not indifference. "And because he was 3 weeks from making it public." Ada sat with this for a long moment. Her uncle, who had called her every Sunday without fail for 26 years, who had taught her to play chess and argued with her about clinical ethics, and sent her a file with a note that said, "I'll explain when I see you," and had never seen her again. "You brought me here to get the file," she said. "Yes." "And you knew when you brought me here that the people who killed him might come for me." A pause. "Yes," he said. The word landed in the room and stayed. Ada looked up at him. "And you thought that was acceptable?" "I thought it was manageable." His jaw tightened. "I was monitoring the situation. I had containment in place. He stopped. "Aren't I underestimated how quickly Kwon would locate you?" "You underestimated?" She heard her own voice. Still level, still clinical, which was the only way she knew how to hold things that were too large for any other register. "My uncle is dead. Someone came to my hospital today, and you underestimated." He held her gaze and did not flinch and did not deflect. "Yes," he said, for the 3rd time. Just that. Just the honest word. Ada looked at him. "You don't protect people by removing their choices," she said. Her own words, from a different conversation. They sounded different now. "No," he said. "I don't." He stood, slowly, walked around the desk and stopped 4 feet from her. Close enough to be honest, far enough to give her room. "I'm telling you everything now, all of it, because you need the full picture to make the choices that are yours to make." He held her eyes. "And because I am not, any longer, willing to make decisions about your safety without your knowledge." The office was quiet. Outside the glass, the hospital moved around them. Staff, trolleys, the ordinary infrastructure of a place where people came to be saved. Ada stood up. "I'm going to need to see everything you have," she said. "Everything. The file, whatever intelligence you have on Kwon, whatever containment you've put in place." She met his gaze directly. "And then I am going to decide what happens next. Not you. Me." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. The elevator stalled between the 4th and 5th floors at 8:14 p.m. Ada looked at her watch 11 seconds before the lights flickered and the car groaned to a stop, and in the specific quiet that followed, her body did what it had been trained not to do. It remembered, not Amika, something older, smaller spaces, 8 years old in her uncle's storage room in Enugu during a power cut. 23 years later, her nervous system had kept meticulous records. Her breathing shifted, controlled enough that most people wouldn't have seen it. He was in the elevator. He had stepped in 3 floors below without comment, and they had ridden in their established silence. A silence that had changed texture since the conversation in his office. Fuller now, carrying more. The backup light cast everything sallow yellow, and Ada was pressing her back against the rear wall, running her protocol. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. It wasn't working as well as usual. She heard herself softly. Chineke nyere aka. God help me. He turned around, not quickly, with his characteristic deliberateness, every motion considered. He read her in under 2 seconds. She saw the calculation complete behind his eyes. And then something else. Something that came after the calculation and was not calculation at all. He moved, positioning himself between her and the doors. Look at me. Low, calm, the register between request and command. She didn't. She was looking at the emergency panel. Ada, her name, 2 syllables, turned over carefully before being deemed worth saying. She looked, 2 feet away, jacket set, her breathing even. 4 to 7 minutes, he said. Restoration queue. I know, she said. You own part of the building. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, barely. She breathed. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. He remained, simply present, solid in the specific way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the quality of his stillness. Ada's breathing evened over 90 seconds. She became aware of her hand, gripping his lapel. Again. She looked at it, looked at him. He hadn't made it a moment. His hand moved to her jaw, slowly, the speed of a touch that understood its own meaning. His thumb traced her cheekbone, barely a pressure, except every nerve in her face mapped it precisely. She was still looking at him. He was still looking at her, and she thought, in the sallow yellow light, with the building running its restoration cycle, and her hand on his lapel, and her uncle's death sitting between everything, she thought, he knew. He brought me here knowing the danger. He monitored my access points and read my files, and positioned himself between me and a threat I didn't even know existed yet. And I am furious about it. And I am still here. His jaw tightened. Barely. Barely. And she saw what it cost him not to close the remaining distance. Control chosen actively, in real time, against something pulling in the opposite direction. That undid her more than anything else could have. Their lips brushed, not a kiss. The proximity of one. The suspended intention of one. Close enough that she felt the warmth of his mouth without the contact, and the breath between them was no longer separate. He didn't close it. She didn't close it. 3 seconds. The unmapped territory between almost and now. Then the lights came back on. The elevator lurched, resumed. His hand dropped. Hers released his jacket. He stepped out at the 5th floor. She stayed in for one more. And in the 10 seconds of the closing doors, Ada Nwosu stood in the fully lit elevator and thought about a man who had engineered her presence in this city, who had known her uncle was murdered and brought her here anyway, and who had just stood between her and the walls of a stalled elevator like it was simply the only place to be. She did not know what to do with any of it. She knew she wasn't walking away. Comment right now. Do you trust him? Should she? Like this video and subscribe. We are deep in it. She hadn't planned to go. Minji had said, Isabella Virelli is coming. She knows things about the group that Dante won't tell you himself. At 6:45 p.m., Ada was in the back of a car, in a dress Minji had acquired through channels Ada didn't examine, telling herself she was going for information. That was mostly true. The ballroom of the Lauda Hotel existed in its own gravity. Gold lighting, cream and dark green tables, 300 people saying nothing with extraordinary precision. Ada walked in, deep wine dress, natural hair pinned up, the posture of a woman who had learned to carry herself in a way that gave no one permission to diminish her. She was not trying to be noticed. She was noticed completely. Minji materialized at her elbow. You walked in like you owned the room. I'm here for information, Ada said. Said Minji. and in the tone of someone who believed approximately 40% of that. Across the room, Dante was speaking to two men, listening with the specific, complete attention of people unaccustomed to subordination who had reorganized themselves into it without appearing to. One of them said something. Dante responded in 2 sentences. Brief, final. The conversation ended on his terms. He was already looking at her. He had been looking at her before she processed she'd been looking at him. Their eyes met across 300 people, and his didn't shift with the adjustment of someone who has just located something. They were still already there, as if he had tracked her the moment she entered and had simply been waiting for her to notice. Ada looked away first. She was getting used to losing that particular exchange. Isabella found her at the appetizer table. "You're the exchange nurse." Pleasantly, trained warmth. Ada Nwosu. Yes. Dark hair, pale skin, a dress that cost more than Ada's monthly stipend. Intelligent eyes conducting a thorough assessment. "Dante mentioned you," Isabella said. "Professionally, I assume." "Of course." A smile that didn't reach the assessment. Then lower. "He brought you here, didn't he?" Not a question. Ada kept her expression level. "He does that," Isabella said, her voice dropping, pleasant on the surface. Underneath, a warning wearing the face of information. He identifies what he needs, and he places it exactly where he can reach it. He's been doing it since he was 22 years old, and he has never once been wrong about a target. A pause. "You should know, the last person who had something Dante needed, and who didn't cooperate." She stopped, selected a different sentence. "They're no longer a consideration." Ada held her gaze. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what you think it means," Isabella said quietly. "And it means that whatever he told you about why you're here, whether it's the complete truth or the beginning of it, you need to understand the full weight of the world you've walked into." Her eyes were serious now, all the pleasant surface stripped away. "I'm not warning you away from him. I'm warning you to be awake, completely awake, because in his world, the only people who are safe are the ones who see everything clearly." Ada absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" Isabella's expression shifted, something genuine underneath. "Because I've known him for 15 years, and she said quietly, and I have never seen him follow someone to their car in the middle of the night just to make sure they got there safely. He doesn't do that. He has people for that." She held Ada's gaze. "When he does something himself, when he goes personally, it means something is different. Something has moved in him that he hasn't named yet." She picked up her glass. "I thought you should know that, whatever you decide to do with it." She moved away. Ada stood at the appetizer table and thought about a man who had brought her across an ocean for a file that had gotten her uncle killed, and who had still followed her to her car himself. She thought about those two things existing in the same person simultaneously, and found to her own frustration that she could hold both without contradiction. He found her at the window an hour later. You came," he said. "For information," she said. A pause that contained what they both knew about that answer. He stood beside her, looking at Seoul. "Isabella spoke to you," he said, briefly. "What did she say?" "That the last person who had something you needed and didn't cooperate is no longer a consideration." Ada kept her eyes on the city. "I'd like to know what that means." Silence. "It means," he said carefully, "that there are situations in my world where uncooperation creates consequences that are outside my control to prevent." A pause. "And that I have spent considerable resources ensuring you are not in that category." Ada turned to look at him. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't, but it's what I can give you in a ballroom with 300 people." He met her eyes directly. "Ask me again when we're alone. Hanam, I'll give you the real one." She looked at him for a long moment. He held out his hand. The ensemble had shifted to something slower. "That is a terrible idea," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Hand still extended. She took it. He danced the way he did everything. Complete control. Nothing wasted. His hand at the small of her back. Placed, like a fact. Ada's spine straightened. "Your body listens to me," he said quietly. "My body hasn't been fully briefed on your methods," she said. He shifted her. one fluid quarter turn, and her breath left her before she could catch it. Short, involuntary, his hand at her waist pressed slightly firmer. Present in a way it hadn't been a second before, like he was marking the moment. "I know you're angry," he said, quiet, just for her. "I'm always angry," she said. "I'm a very functional angry. It doesn't stop me from doing things clearly." "I know," something in his voice. "That's why you—" "Don't," she said. "Not yet." He didn't push it. They danced. Seoul glowed below. 300 people moved around them. His jaw was close to her temple. She could feel his breath. Her fingers had curled slightly into his shoulder without her authorization. He pulled her into the shadow between the drapes and the window. One step in a direction, a natural continuation, and then the ballroom was a muffled, warm glow, and they were alone. His hand moved to her jaw. Same touch as the elevator, except different now. She knew more now. He knew she knew. The touch carried the full weight of everything between them. The corridor, the file, her uncle, the man who had come to reception asking for her by ward assignment. His thumb traced her cheekbone. His fingers curved at the side of her face. She felt the slight unsteadiness of his hand. That imperfect control, that real cost, and it was more dangerous than anything certain could have been. "Tell me to stop," he said. She looked at him in the thin shadow. She didn't. He kissed her. Slow. So slow. His mouth warm, the kiss measured, controlled hunger that cost something to maintain. And she felt in the tension of his jaw exactly what it was costing. Her hand moved to his chest, his heart beat against her palm, faster than his expression would ever have admitted to anyone who wasn't close enough to feel it. His other arm moved around her waist and drew her slightly closer, and the sound she made was quiet and involuntary, and she felt him respond. A slight intake, a tightening, before he stopped. Pulled back, his forehead nearly at hers, breathing rough at the edges now. "If I continue," a pause, words selected carefully. "You won't walk away." Ada heard the truth of it. He stepped back, straightened his jacket, half a second longer than usual. Looked at her once, the full picture of her, in one long look, and returned to the room. Ada stood in the shadow and pressed 2 fingers to her lips, and thought, "He brought me here for a file that killed my uncle, and I am standing in a shadow in Seoul wanting him to come back. I don't know what that says about me. I don't know what it says about him. I know it says something about both of us that I haven't finished reading yet." She heard his voice before she saw his face. That voice, the timbre of it, the accent she had spent 7 months not missing. Parking structure concrete, 9:47 p.m., 12-hour shift behind her. She turned. Ethan Cole was standing beside her car. New jacket, same jaw, same eyes she had spent 12 months reading for which version of him had arrived. "How did you find me?" "Exchange program records are public." One step forward. "You won't even talk to me?" "There's nothing to talk about." 3 years, Ada. "Were 3 years of me making myself smaller so you'd feel bigger," she said. Level, final. "Leave." He took another step. Never dramatic. That had always been the specific difficulty with Ethan. Calibrated just under the line, requiring her to escalate by objecting, and then the objection became the problem. She knew this pattern completely. Her back was near the concrete pillar. He was between her and the exit. "You don't have to be like this," voice softening. "I came all this way." He reached for her arm. "Just don't." He stopped. Not because of her voice, because of the quality of the silence that had just entered the parking structure. Ada felt it before she looked. The atmospheric shift, but colder than usual, more absolute. The specific temperature of a room when something with real authority enters and the room understands immediately, without being told, what category of thing has arrived. Dante Virelli stepped from the shadow of the parking column. Behind him, 2 steps back and to the left, the broad-shouldered man, and beside him, someone she hadn't seen before. Younger, leaner. Is positioned with the specific stillness of someone for whom this was professional, not incidental. 2 of them. Tonight he had brought 2. Dante walked toward them at his normal pace, unhurried, deliberate. The walk of a man who had never needed to move faster than this because speed had never been the point. Presence was the point. Certainty was the point. He stopped 4 feet from Ethan. He looked at him. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. "You're in a private hospital parking structure," Dante said. Quiet. The kind of quiet that existed below volume, that lived in the register underneath sound. After 9 p.m., without a visitor pass, in contact with a member of staff who has asked you to leave. A pause that was a complete sentence on its own. "This ends now," Ethan assessed him, trying to find the category, and Dante gave him nothing. No aggression, no raised voice, no posturing. Just presence and eyes that had been in significantly harder situations than this one and registered exactly zero concern about any of it. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. "Someone you don't want to have a longer conversation with," Dante said. The broad-shouldered man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. The younger one beside him was watching Ethan with the particular attention of someone cataloging details for later reference. Ethan looked at them. 2 seconds. 3. The recalculation happened visibly, across his jaw, behind his eyes in the slight shift of his weight backward. He looked at Ada one more time. She gave him nothing. He turned, walked to the elevator. The doors opened. He stepped in. Both men followed at a measured distance. Dante watched the doors close. And then he turned to Ada, and everything reorganized, where the authority, the cold precision, all of it shifting into something oriented only toward her. "Are you hurt?" "No," she exhaled. "I'm not hurt." He closed the distance slowly, nothing sudden, and stopped close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "You're real," she said, unguarded, off register. "Right?" That crossed his face, the thing she'd never seen there before, something it cost him to let her see. "Yes," he said, like it mattered to get exactly right. Ada reached up and touched his jaw, rougher than expected, warmer. His breath changed. "You're real," she said again. He covered her hand with his, pressing her palm against his jaw, letting her feel the warmth and the solidity of him, and nodded. She kissed him. Nothing like the gala. That had been discovery. Slow and weighted. This was relief. The specific, desperate quality of danger passed, and someone solid standing in its place. Her hands moved to his jacket. His arms came around her, firm, present, and he kissed her back with everything he'd been holding since the ballroom, and for one moment neither of them was careful about anything. Then he stopped. Gently, his forehead to hers, their breathing tangled in the cold parking structure air. She laughed, involuntary, exhaustion and disbelief. "You always stop." "Yes." Voice rough now, genuinely rough. "Why?" His thumb found her cheekbone. "Because when it continues," he said, "I need it to be a choice you make in a hallway and not in the aftermath of fear." Ada closed her eyes. The integrity of it, from this man, with all his layers, was almost unbearable. "The men you brought tonight," she said quietly. "Yes." "You knew Ethan was coming." A pause. "I knew someone connected to your past had entered the country 3 days ago. I didn't know his specific intent." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I wasn't going to wait to find out." Ada absorbed this. "And Quan?" she asked. "The man from reception?" His hand stilled. "He's been relocated." She looked up at him. "What does that mean?" Dante met her eyes. "It means he won't be asking questions about you anymore." The parking structure was cold and quiet around them. Ada held his gaze and thought about what relocated meant in the vocabulary of a man like Dante Virelli. Thought about Dr. Park Sung-jin, whose nameplate had disappeared from his office door. Thought about her uncle who had been 3 weeks from Geneva when his heart stopped. Thought about Isabella saying, "The only people who are safe are the ones who see everything clearly." "Tell me the real answer," she said, "the one you owe me from the ballroom." He looked at her for a long moment. "In my world," he said, "there are situations where the only language available is consequence. I don't manufacture those situations, but I don't pretend they don't exist." His eyes stayed on hers. "Quan came to your hospital. He asked for you by ward. He works for people who killed your uncle." A pause. He won't do it again. Ada held his gaze. She held the full weight of what he was, all the layers, the suits and the board meetings, and the broad-shouldered men, and the relocated and the camera switched to maintenance mode, and the 40-minute meetings with people whose names never appeared on guest lists. She held all of it. Hey, we still need to talk, she said. About the file, about what comes next. I know. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he said. She stepped back, looked at him once more, and walked to her car. The note said, rooftop, when you're ready. If you're not ready, don't come. Ada had spent 3 days reading her uncle's file. All of it. Every page of the data set, every annotation, every flagged transaction and shell entity and financial instrument that Dr. Chukwuemeka Ose had spent the last months of his life mapping with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly how dangerous the map was. She understood now why Dante had needed to find her. She understood also what he had chosen not to do, because a man like Dante Virelli could have obtained that file through means that had nothing to do with employment contracts and exchange programs. He had resources. He had people. He had the kind of network that made things happen quietly and left no visible fingerprints. He had brought her here instead. When she thought about that on the rooftop, Seoul spread below in electric sprawl, a city that had rebuilt itself multiple times and decided each time to go brighter. He was at the railing, not reviewing anything, just standing. She joined him. The quiet between them had its own texture now, inhabited. I read everything, she said. I know. My uncle found evidence of medical facility transactions being used to move capital from 3 different criminal networks through legitimate hospital infrastructure across 4 countries. She kept her eyes on the city. He found names, dates, transfer records. A pause. He found your name, Dante. Silence. Not as a participant, she said, and as someone who had flagged the same transactions internally and had been trying to shut them down from inside the group for 14 months before he died. She turned to look at him. He knew you were trying to fix it. He was going to name you as a witness, not a target. Dante looked at the city. Yes, he said. You've been trying to dismantle it from inside, she said. That's why you needed the file, not to bury it, to complete the case. The case needed an external record, he said. Everything I had was internal documentation, possible to discredit. Your uncle's data set is independent, academic, verifiable. He turned to look at her. With both, there's enough to take to the right people in Geneva and have it stick. Ada looked at him. Ada Reyurason. And at this man who ran underground networks and made senior cardiologists disappear from rosters and had relocated the man who came looking for her, and who had also been quietly, methodically trying to dismantle the criminal infrastructure inside his own organization for over a year. Both things, true simultaneously. I can't handle you, she said. He exhaled, soft through his nose, and something in his face did a thing she hadn't seen before. Not softening, arriving, completely here. You were never meant to, he said. You said that to me once before, the first night, in the corridor. I remember. You said I couldn't satisfy you. I remember that too. Were you wrong? The question sat between them in the cold Seoul air. He looked at her for a long moment. I was wrong, he said. Quiet, certain. From a man who used words like instruments, precisely, deliberately, never carelessly. Ada heard the full weight of it. His hand moved, slowly, up her arm from wrist to elbow to shoulder, tracing the outside of her arm, a contact so careful it was almost absence, except her entire nervous system registered every millimeter of it with humiliating precision. His hand came to rest at the side of her neck, not pulling, not gripping, just resting. His palm warm against her throat, his thumb at the angle of her jaw, his fingers loose against her nape. A presence, not a claim. She felt her pulse against his hand. She knew he felt it too. I push back, she said, on everything. I will tell you exactly when you've overstepped, and I will not soften it. Good. I don't forgive easily. I know. And I'm taking the file to Geneva myself, Ada, with your documentation. Together. The way my uncle intended it, not through your channels, not managed by your people. She met his eyes. My terms. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not resistance, not calculation. Something that looked, for a man who controlled outcomes for a living, remarkably like relief. Yes, he said. You said that to me once before too, she said. Just, yes. It was the right answer then as well, he said. Ada looked at him, at everything he was, all the layers she had now seen clearly, completely, without flattering either of them. She leaned up. He didn't pull her. He waited. She closed the distance herself, and the city lit the two of them from below. Seoul's 10,000 colors. As Ada Nwosu, who had crossed an ocean to find herself and found considerably more than she'd planned, he kissed the man who had been looking for her long before he understood why, and meant it, and stayed. For the first time in his life, he didn't want satisfaction. He wanted something that could resist him, and stay. Minji found the note on the break room whiteboard. Precise, slightly slanted handwriting. The night nurse on Ward C does exceptional work. DV. She stared at it, took a photo, sent it to Ada with no caption. 3 seconds later, he's insufferable. Minji, you're smiling right now. 6 seconds. Shut up. Minji smiled into her coffee. Downstairs in the corridor outside Ward C, a man in a near-black suit stood reading a tablet. The hospital moved and adjusted and reorganized itself around him the way it always did. He didn't notice. He was reading a nursing report filed at 3 a.m., meticulous, precise, the voice of someone who trusted no one else to get the details right. He read it to the end, turned back to page 1, started again. In her locker, behind her spare badge and a photograph of her mother, Ada kept 2 things. An encrypted drive, her uncle's data, the map of 12 years of careful architecture, now copied and filed with a lawyer in Geneva and a journalist in Amsterdam, and a regulatory body that had been waiting for 14 months for exactly this kind of independent verification. And a note, precise, slightly slanted handwriting. It said, "You were right, I was wrong." She had never told him she'd kept it. He had never asked. Some things didn't need to be said. Some things just needed to be true. Somewhere in the city, in an office with no external cameras and no name on the door, a phone rang. The man who answered it listened for 11 seconds without speaking. Then he set the phone down, reached for his jacket, looked at the photograph on his desk. A public health researcher, Lagos, 20 years ago, smiling at a conference. Moen said to no one in the room, "She filed it." He stood, straightened his jacket, and left. Episode 2 is coming, and that is where we leave them. Not with resolution, with a beginning, and a clock that just started ticking. Because Ada filed the data. The people who killed her uncle now know it, and somewhere in Seoul, a man just stood up from his chair. The most dangerous love stories don't end with the first kiss. They end with the first choice to stay, after you've seen every layer of who the other person is, after you know the complicated truth and choose anyway. Ada knows who he is, all of it, every layer. He knows who she is, all of it. They chose each other, and now the world they chose each other inside of is about to respond. If this story held you from that first corridor to that last phone call, subscribe right now and hit the bell. This community shows up every week and we are building something real here. Drop a comment. Which moment wrecked you most? The elevator? The parking structure? When he said I was wrong? Or that final phone call? Tell me below. I read every single one. Like this video so more people find this story. Your like is the algorithm. This story deserves to be seen. Comment episode 2 right now if you need to know what happens next, because someone just stood up from their chair, and Ada is not as safe as she thinks. Don't sleep. Next story drops soon.